When did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
And welcome to the show, everybody. I am your host, Steve Asher, and this is House of Asher. We are on episode 101. We had just reached the 100 mark last episode, and we're going to keep chugging on, bringing you great guests and hopefully interesting topics and all that good stuff. But I do need to say, if you may be listening to me on Spreaker. You also may be listening to on iHeart, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and also worldwide through Paranormal UK Radio. And that goes all the way from the British Isles and out north and down all the way to the South Pole and all the way around Africa and beyond. So thank you for listening and let me be part of your day. I appreciate that. Okay. Anybody who went to school probably had to read Shakespeare. And I know what you probably think. A lot of kids was like, oh my God, come on, no, really? This guy. But what's so interesting is, first of all, just a lot of modern works were affected by this person to such a degree that, people don't even realize it. But there's something even more amazing about this character that some people said the man who supposedly that we knew as Shakespeare may not have actually been the writer, may not have had anything to do with it, might have been sort of a red herring to protect other people, but we'll get into that a little bit deeper. And that's actually what our guest is going to be talking about. Let me give you a quick little bio, folks, and hopefully I won't butcher this too badly. If so, forgive me. Katherine Chiljan is an independent scholar who has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 30 years. She is a graduate of the UCLA with a BA in history. Chiljan became interested in the controversy when Charlton Ogburn, author of The Mysterious William Shakespeare in 1984, appeared on a television debate with a Shakespeare professor. She then started doing her own research and eventually publishing 2 anthologies about the 17th century Earl of Oxford and acting editor of the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter. In 2003, she debated English professors on the topic at the Smithsonian Institute. Chiljan was inspired to write Shakespeare Suppressed, the uncensored truth about Shakespeare and his works, first in 2011, and then it came back in reprint in 2016 after hearing a prominent English professor insult doubters of the traditional Shakespeare on national television. Now, the book took almost 7 years to complete and earned her an award for distinguished scholarship from Concordia University, Portland, Oregon in 2012. The book was reprinted in 2016. She was one of the contributors to Contested Year in 2016, which uncovered shoddy scholarship in a recent book about King Lear by a prominent Shakespeare professor. Everybody, please welcome to the show, Katherine Chiljan. And here's why I'm doing my clapping, but I don't have a clap thing, so there we go. Hey, Katherine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's an honor to be on your show.
Well, thank you so much. And well, go
to
ahead.
get the full truth out about Shakespeare.
We gotta, because like I said, it's such a people do themselves such a disservice because a lot of people the speech is it's vexing, to kind of use a term from then. It's most people do not speak like that, and it really takes some doing to get used of the vibe. It's just like if you move, even if you go to other regions, like here in the South, you come here and our English is different. It's just how it was. And especially then when you have sort of the old English vibe and just, we don't use terminology like that anymore. And people really scratch their heads on it. Were you always like a fan of this sort of thing, or did this kind of come up due to your research?
When I was out of college, I thought, gee, I should really read Hamlet. It's such a, famous book, and Shakespeare is considered the greatest author, of the English language. So I think I should, make the effort to read this. And And that's when I first became interested in the authorship, merely from the fact that when I looked inside Hamlet, this edited version, and it gave a list of all the Shakespeare plays, and next to each play, we're talking about 40 or so plays, next to each play there was a question mark at the date of when they think it was written. But every single one of those 40s had a question mark next to it, and it struck me as very odd that this should be the case. After 200 plus years of scholarship, they still don't know when Hamlet was written. They're not even sure. So that really raised an eyebrow with me. And then, of course, I saw, as you mentioned in the introduction, a debate between a Shakespeare professor at a prominent university debating Charlton Ogburn. And Charlton Ogburn was questioning the traditional Shakespeare, who is the man who was born in Stratford-on-Avon. And that was versus the Earl of Oxford, who Charlton Ogburn believes was the real author. And so Ogburn was defending the Earl of Oxford, and the Princeton professor was defending the traditional Shakespeare. Well, the Orthodox scholar could not prove that this person was the great author, but Charlton Ogburn's man, he kept throwing out this incredible story of perfect parallels of his life. And the fact that the Earl of Oxford was a known playwright who wrote anonymously. And so all of this contributed toward my interest. And then, as you mentioned, when another Shakespeare professor insulted doubters like me of traditional Shakespeare, that's when I said, okay, I'm going to write a book. and that turned into almost 7 years of research in Shakespeare Suppressed.
Well, let me ask you this. I know outside of London, the Stratford-upon-Avon, which I'm sure I'm screwing that up, I know it has the greatest draw of tourists in England because it's known as the birthplace of the great author William Shakespeare. The thing is, you think that that's factually incorrect. Why is that?
It is because, and this is what I reveal in my book, if you look at the evidence for the Stratford man as being a writer, it's non-existent during his lifetime. We don't have any proof that he was a writer. We have no lifetime proof. It's only after his death that Shakespeare scholars make that association between him and the great author. But during his lifetime, no one ever did. So that's very problematic on their end. And, you have to see this person who was born in Stratford-on-Avon with the name William Shakespeare. We don't doubt that. And this person, during his lifetime, was associated with the theater. We have a couple documents showing that he owned theater shares and that he was involved with an acting company, actually 2 acting companies. But the problem is that acting and owning theater shares does not mean you're a writer. You need proof of that. You need actual documents to have survived, like letters. But we don't have any letters in Shakespeare's handwriting. All we have are 6 signatures, 3 of which were on his will, and 3 others on other documents. That's all we have. We don't have any letters. And that's very problematic. We also have no payments to a writer, William Shakespeare.
Well, yeah. Do you find that, I'm sorry to interject, but, do you find that as well, how do I say it? I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but I'm gonna. Do you feel that someone spirited away any sort of evidence that maybe didn't support that, but supported another theory? Because you've heard everybody talk about, well, this guy, maybe they thought he was a baker, or there were various Shakespeares, and so kind of what's your takeaway on that? I mean, what do you think the purpose of that would have been?
Well, you have to put it in context. During this period, people who were of the nobility, they would write anonymously. They would not own up to their being involved with creative writing, like plays or poems. So they would never say that. But after their death, they should have been recognized.
Well,
and this did not happen for Shakespeare.
Well,
and the problem is that he used a pen name. William Shakespeare was the great author's pen name. It wasn't a man who was born with that name. These are two different entities, two different Shakespeares. And the problem is after both of their deaths, the great author of Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, his death, and the man from Stratford's death, after they both died, then these two entities got merged into one.
Now, was that just as time went and the stories grew and just, over time, sometimes definite facts, and if, like you said, if there's not a paper trail in regards of that people kind of cross, because I've always heard, to touch on things like King Arthur, that there were certain different people that they kind of amalgamated into this sort of more than human character to take on sort of this mythical role. It sort of sounds like something like that similarly happened with Shakespeare, but I mean, we have records of his birth and stuff, right? I mean, there's some tangible stuff that show that this man really existed.
Yes, well, the Stratford man, he was definitely a human being. He was born in Stratford. Actually, he was born, they think, on April 23rd, but they don't know for sure. They just assume it because his baptism was 3 days later on the 26th. So, he was a real person, and we have some records, even of his father, but his parents were illiterate. That's right off raises a red flag. He's not being born into a literary family or someone who is literate. As far as we know, the story goes that he went to the local grammar school. Now, Stratford-on-Avon was a small town. It was not a big commercial center. But we don't know for sure if he went to the grammar school because the records don't lie. We assume that he did. Anyway, the Shakespeare scholars assume that he did. In the absence of records, it makes it difficult. But when you have both parents illiterate and no evidence of handwriting in the form of letters, I mean, it kind of makes it.
We would assume that he would be illiterate as well.
Right. And keep in mind that, besides his parents being illiterate, the Stratford man's two daughters were illiterate too. We don't have any letters in their handwriting.
Well, that would
be. It's very unlikely that the most literate man in the universe, the great author of Hamlet, wouldn't have taught his children how to read and write.
Right. Well, and that's the thing because, Shakespeare used, a lot of Latin and a lot of things like that. And invented a lot of words himself that's used now, throughout the English language. And, it wouldn't make a lot of sense that he would have uneducated children.
Yes, it does not make sense. And they never claimed that their father was famous. And his granddaughter, who was his last descendant, who died about 50 years after her grandfather, nobody went to her and tried to question her or interview her about her supposedly famous grandfather. It's just a big blank. Even the Stratford man's neighbors, and again, like I said, this is a small town. No one claimed that this is the town of the great Shakespeare. Not for a couple hundred years, till the 1700s.
Well, how does it turn around? I mean, how does it turn around? I didn't mean to welcome what you were saying. I apologize, but
Yeah.
how does it turn around and to, where you have, you know, he is like the toast of the town. I mean, that's what the town's famous for, right? And how?
But he wasn't. That's the problem.
Well,
And you have
okay.
to keep in mind, that when contemporaries, now we're talking about the 16th and early 17th century, we're talking about this period, that writers of this period did make, some references to Shakespeare, but they didn't describe the man in Stratford-on-Avon. He was totally different. They infer that he was a man who had a high position, that he wrote anonymously, that he was a generous patron of other writers, and one person implied that he was dead by 1605, and the Stratford man died in 1616. So, this is all problematic, and it's never reconciled by Orthodox Shakespeare professors. And then you go back to the amount of schooling that the great author had, and we're talking, about the grammar school. The great author knew French and Italian. He knew ancient Greek, and like you said, Latin. He invented, you mentioned, he invented many words, almost 2,000 words. And a lot of these words have Latin and Greek roots. He knew the law. He knew medicine. He knew the Bible. He had a tremendous vocabulary, over 17,000 words. And a Stanford study claims that he had over 30,000 word vocabulary.
Which is
with,
not.
With variants of the same word.
I mean, and the thing is, in that time, this was not a No Child Left Behind type thing. It was, there was still a caste system quality to what's going on, and that type of thing were for the leaders, for a well-rounded king, or dukes, earls, duchesses.
Yes. Yeah. For example, rhetoric, which Shakespeare shows evidence of knowing rhetoric, that's something that was only taught at the university level. And we have university records, Cambridge and Oxford. There's no William Shakespeare that attended. So, you get all of these zeros, all these blanks where you expect to find somebody of his erudition, and you don't find any evidence of it. And that's when you come to the conclusion that the name was a pen name. And in fact, when some of the plays were printed, they had the name William Shakespeare on the cover with a hyphen between Shake and Spear. The first edition of Hamlet shows that very clearly. So it was only about half of these editions had a hyphen in the name, which was an indication of a made-up name, spear shaking.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. I mean, so let's say he did not write the book, okay? But he at least was some sort of working actor, writer, trying to earn a living, right?
Well, that's the story. That's the Shakespeare in Love story. But as we mentioned, there's no evidence that he was a writer during his lifetime. All of this was sort of invented after he died. But he was involved in the theater, and that's something I want listeners to know. He was involved in the theater, the Stratford Band. But being an actor, possibly being an actor, there's no evidence of what role he was in, which is unlike other famous actors of the period, like Edward Allen. We know the roles that he played, but we don't know anything about Shakespeare's supposed acting career. It's a big zero again. So we're always coming back to a zero, and we want to find him. And that's not the way it should be for somebody whose works were extremely famous and well quoted, during this time. He had to have been somebody special. So when you go to the concept of the name William Shakespeare was a pen name, then you say, okay, well, who was using the pen name? And that's what leads us to somebody of high rank who didn't want the stigma of being associated with the theater or poetry. And that person, ultimately, it was discovered in 1920, was Edward de Vere, who was the 17th Earl of Oxford. Very, very high position in England, one of the most highly ranked men in the country.
So let me ask you this. So you kind of talk about, at least in that time, like now, everybody's, I want to be a movie star. I want to be a this. Then it was sort of, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was sort of considered more of sort of a carny lifestyle, gypsy kind of vibe, and that, they're sort of, not, well-rounded men of renown. They're like almost like a jester or something. They're playing these roles. They're not, maybe not trustworthy because, they jump in between these type of characters. And I guess maybe to be in a position of some sort of, in whatever type of court, to go, well, you're a leader. You're supposed to, inspire these men to want to go to war. You're not, coming out juggling and, quoting different Greek tragedies. Is going to make you look foolish and less inspiring to the people.
Someone of high rank, like the Earl of Oxford, he should be a minister to the Queen, the monarch. In that time, it was Queen Elizabeth I. And or you should be a general, or you should be, somebody important in her cabinet. You shouldn't be out, writing plays. But obviously, it was his passion to do so. And it turns out that a lot of these plays were written, in fact, for Queen Elizabeth and her court. So Queen Elizabeth, when she was entertained with plays, it was not at the public theater. She did not go there and sit in the audience. The theater came to her in her palaces or various places. And only her and her small group of courtiers would see these plays. So, and the Earl of Oxford being among her courtiers, it was the natural place for him to be. And this makes it all the more exciting to know that he was sort of an insider, a court insider. And that plays into one of the reasons why it appears to have been covered up, that he was the author of the Shakespeare works.
Well, it seems that anytime you bring something forward, which I've said this before to other people I've interviewed and other people that I've talked to about my own writings, truth is truth, and it may not be a comfortable thing. It may not be what you want to hear, and, it's kind of one of those, don't ever meet your heroes type things, because, men have feet of clay, and we are not many men, it's humanity. But it's a thing where, did you feel that after that point, to where they had kind of demigoded this guy into this, lofty, unattainable type creature,
yeah.
Is that where it's like, hey, we've got a good thing going. Let's not rock the boat. And then also, of course, I'm sure the people in that part of Britain and the people who latched onto that, to go, oh no, well, this is a national treasure and this is part of our. It's kind of like like the Queen's jewels. This is one of a very large feather in our hats. How much of it was that, and how much of it was just people didn't want to change the history books? Because you hear that a lot, and because I hate to say alternative history, because if what you're saying is true, it's not alternative. That's the actual history, and the other stuff is the alternative history. Yes.
Well, maybe it's a little bit of both, but keep in mind what this really was, in my opinion, and which I explain in the last two chapters of my books. It was an attempt to decontextualize the Shakespeare works. I think because sometimes some courtiers were being maybe mocked in them, and maybe at the time it seemed that who they were very obvious. Like one great example is in Hamlet, the character Polonius was a lampooning, and many historians accept this, was a lampooning of Queen Elizabeth's top minister, whose name is Lord Burleigh. And, it was not a flattering portrayal. So, that would be certainly one reason the powers that be, the higher powers that be, wouldn't have want that to be revealed historically. That's just one instance. There are other instances too. But if you put the authorship on a person who had no access to Lord Burleigh, then posterity is never going to make that connection of those two. See, this connection was made, centuries later. So I think that was going on. And it was deliberate. It was really a hoax. And the hoax was so good that it's still accepted to this day. But the problem is it's an injustice to the true author, and it's injustice to the people who love Shakespeare, because they're missing out on the true biography of the great author. I mean, there's Shakespeare's biography. There's so many, and several new ones come out every year. So people are buying them, right? They want to know who is this man behind this incredible language and wonderful characters and funny lines and all this. They want to know who he was, but they're given the wrong story. He wasn't a guy from a small town, who worked his way up from holding horses at a theater for an acting company to becoming an actor and then becoming the greatest author in the universe. It didn't happen that way. The true author had an incredible life and an incredible education too, including a grand tour of Europe, which is the location of several Shakespeare plays.
Wow.
So,
okay. Everybody that's listening, if you guys have just tuned in, we're talking with Katherine Chiljan, and we're discussing Shakespeare and the hoax that's been basically perpetrated for several hundred years at this point. Also, I want to remind people to check out stevieasher.com. That's all lowercase together. And check us out on Paranormal UK Radio and also on YouTube under House of Asher. Katherine, what is the website that you use that's easiest for people to get a hold of you through?
ShakespeareSuppressed.com.
Awesome. And is that also where they can get your books?
Yes, and they can also get it on Amazon too.
There you go. Well, let me ask you this. Now, I know in one of your chapters it features comments about Shakespeare made by his fellow writers in print. Now, what do they say about him, and why are these comments not generally known to the public?
Yes, I think I had mentioned some of them hinted that he was a person of high rank, and some of them hinted that he was using a pen name. Like, for example, John Davies, he called Shakespeare, quote unquote, English Terence, or English Terence. Well, Terence was an ancient Roman playwright, but it was believed in Elizabethan times that Terence was really a front for two noble authors. So here you have the idea of using somebody else's name. In other words, Shakespeare was someone's pen name for a nobleman. So if you delve a little bit deeper in these type of references, you can see this. Another reference was in 1607, saying that Shakespeare was the neighbor of the Muses. Now, the Muses were the goddesses of the arts. So if you're a neighbor of a goddess, it means that you're in heaven. You're no longer of this earth. So that's another way of saying that he's dead, 1607. But the Stratford man died in 1616. So, these are type of things that the scholars don't delve into deeply enough or even take notice of. And, that's, again, it's totally wrong.
Well, I know that in Shakespeare's works, I know that they had been very famous during his lifetime as they are now, but I know that you said that no one really noticed his death and you would have thought there would have been a lot of fanfare and lamenting and all this. So, I mean,
Yes,
it's so
that is
strange. It's
that is one
strange.
of the strangest parts about Shakespeare's supposed life is when he died supposedly in 1616. No one said a word, and yet all of his contemporaries, whenever they died, someone would write a tribute within a year or so. They would write a tribute. They would take notice. They would mention it. People would mention it in a letter, even. But you don't have that for one of the greatest authors of the period, recognized by his contemporaries as great. It didn't happen for him. Not after 1 year, not after 2 years. It took 7 years. Now that's something wrong there. And the first tribute to him was in a book that was published in 1623, and we call that Shakespeare's first folio. And folio refers to the large page size, so it's a big book of Shakespeare plays. And in the opening few pages, that's where you have some tributes to Shakespeare. And on one page, you have a reference to Shakespeare having a Stratford monument. And then on another page, another writer calls Shakespeare Sweet Swan of Avon. So
which is it?
Yeah, well, you put those two together, Stratford and Avon, and you have Shakespeare's from Stratford-on-Avon. Okay, but nowhere in the entire work, opening pages, is there a biography of him explaining who he was, and there is not the phrase Stratford-upon-Avon. So, and there's many irregularities in these opening pages as well. The opening first page has him, an image of the great author, supposedly an image. But you look at it, and it's not like the other images of writers during this period. During this period, if you were a celebrated author, you would have bay leaves around your head, or you would be holding a pen or a book or something to indicate you are
right. A quill or something of
a quill, a writer. But the very famous black and white image of Shakespeare that we all know, there's no such thing there. It just shows him as a gentleman, maybe. That's it. And then opposite the page are a few lines of verse written by Ben Jonson, who was another dramatist of the period. And he tells you, don't look on this image. Look at the book, meaning read his works, and you're going to find out who he is. Don't look at this picture. So there's a lot of strangeness, which I go into great detail in my book about these opening pages. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that, and which is also very, very peculiar, is that I know that you say most Shakespeare biographies are extremely speculative. Even touching on a very large gap in his 20s. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. Most Shakespeare biographies you read, there's so little concrete evidence, facts pertaining to, the literary world or his supposed acting career. There's so few of these that what are they left with? Very little. So they have to sort of fill in. And therefore, there's been a lot of great speculation. And sometimes they don't even say it's speculation. Sometimes they just say it as fact. Fact that he went to the grammar school. Fact that, he watched the execution of someone, and that inspired The Merchant of Venice. Things like that, which have no fact in reality. An interesting quote is by Mark Twain, that the Stratford man's case is like a reconstructed brontosaur, 9 bones and 600 barrels of plaster of Paris. So it's totally true. That's what you're getting. You're getting a tiny bit of facts or facts of the period, not the man. And the rest is speculation. And what I do is I give you, the reader, all the facts and what contemporaries wrote too. That is the most important of all.
Well, and it's really strange because, like I said, I know in my research because of mainly about ghosts and folklore and this and that, but it's it's so different because when you touch on a literal character and a supposed literary character, it's hard to see how, like I mean, I can see how the lines blur, but then there's also these people who supposedly knew him, because I know some of the biographies of people and different things were taken from people that supposedly knew the character, and it seems like like you said, it seems like there had to have been multiple Shakespeare's, but do you feel that any of the writing do you feel it was just one individual? Do you feel it was a cabal of people working together in tandem? And how would that even have worked that way? Because like I said, I'm definitely not a playwright. So I mean, what do you feel on that? I mean, do you definitely feel it was one noble person, or do you feel it was a group of people kind of adding to the soup?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a lot of people think that. But no, I think that the Earl of Oxford wrote all of the plays. In fact, more than we even admit that scholars think today. It could be as high as 50. Interestingly, a lot of people don't know, like, for example, the play King Lear, okay? There was another play about King Lear. Very similar plot, similar characters, everything, but it's a little different. And that's just one example, but it was earlier, right? And there's about 7 or 8 of these earlier versions, like Taming of the Shrew and Taming of a Shrew, the earlier play. So these really were earlier Shakespeare plays. But see, they won't say that because it would disqualify the Stratford man. Too many plays, like we're talking 50 plays now, would have to be accounted for in a very small period, maybe about 20-year period for the Stratford man. It just doesn't work.
Okay, so
and also there was early plays like at court, like for example in 1577, Queen Elizabeth saw a play called The History of Error. Well, that was almost certainly Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. In 1577, the Stratford man was like 12 years old or something. So he just doesn't work. His dates don't work. And if you change who the real author is, it's going to change our interpretation of everything. It's going to turn it upside down. All this research that Orthodox scholars have been doing for 200 years, it's going to be turned upside down.
It's just I'm kind of left dumbfounded by it because I've talked to different people through different economic and educational degrees. And it's sort of it fascinates me and it kind of shocks me that these learned people, some intellectuals, whatever, are as dogmatic as maybe the most fervent religious zealot when it comes on to their kind of golden cows, as it were. Their idol or whatever, or their namesakes or whatever. It seems they're so guarded, and it's funny because, like you said, the facts don't add up. If they're having these, like you said, played in courts, through different nobility, years and years before this kid was able to do anything, which you said the child come from a totally illiterate family, definitely probably at age 12, I don't think he would have become illiterate at the age of 20 if he was that bright.
Yes. Yeah, it's crazy, and it's so unfair to the real author. I don't know if you're aware, but Shakespeare wrote many sonnets, 14-line poems, where he talks about himself and the people that he loves, and they're very highly personal. And he says, "My name be buried where my body is, and live no more." So he seemed to be aware that his name, his real name, would not be attached to the works. Something happened where he knew this. And if you look as late as 1640, which was about around 25 years after the Stratford man had died, somebody wrote, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." So, almost a generation after the Stratford man had died, people were still being compelled to stay silent about who he was. I think that's very strange.
Well, like I know that it somehow kind of dovetailed into like one story. This is my story. I'm sticking to it, as it were. Exactly when and how did he become associated with a great writer? Was it someone who possibly knew this guy in some capacity? Was it just a convenient ploy, sort of a nobody, a castaway person to go, oh, we'll just put it on them, and then we don't have to question how such great works, how very educated the writer must be, came from this, I don't want to say lowly guy, but just a commoner. How did that happen?
I think it happened after they both died. Again, I had mentioned the first folio, the Book of Shakespeare Plays, 1623. That's when the myth started, because no one before that ever associated the great author with Stratford-on-Avon. It started with this book, when this book came out. And the book was dedicated to two noblemen. They were brothers, and they were also earls. They had high positions. The Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Montgomery. And they were really the ones, I believe, who funded this book. And if they funded the book, then they also funded the opening pages, the page of the kind of the ugly black and white supposed face of the great author. And they funded people making the reference to Stratford Monument and to Avon. So I think they were behind it. And I briefly mentioned Shakespeare's sonnets. I think a lot of the cover-up had to involve Shakespeare's sonnets, because in the sonnets he discusses, he lauds a young man, a beautiful young man. And there's a lot of evidence that points to the young man being the child of Queen Elizabeth, and she was supposedly a virgin queen. So if you cover up the identity of the man who wrote those sonnets, which were published in 1609, they were published during this time, it was pretty damaging, or let's say potentially damaging. And I think that was a good reason for the cover-up. Yeah.
Well, I know you had mentioned the picture and how, like you said, they said, don't really look at the picture, but was there any evidence that this guy was, how do I say, diminished in some which way? Physical malformations, mental malformations, and whatever. Was there any possibility of that? Because, like you said, the picture's not flattering at all.
No, in fact, some of us feel, if you look on the right side of the picture, there are two lines near the cheek and underneath the ear. You can see kind of two lines which doesn't quite fit anatomically. So it kind of gives the illusion of like a mask, like he's wearing a mask that can be taken off. Because if you look at the big forehead, it looks very wooden. It doesn't look like a normal skull, or not skull, but I mean someone's normal forehead.
Right. And
in fact, in 1640, someone commented on this picture, and they wrote it. They poems, and they made a similar image as the one in the first folio, and they reversed it, and they put writing underneath it that said, "This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's?" with a question mark. The soul of the age, So we're talking 1640 when somebody is doubting the traditional Shakespeare attribution. And that's very important. Our critics say, "Oh, no, no one questioned this until the 1800s," and it's not true. It was being questioned.
Well, I never even took in consideration that could have represented some sort of kind of garish mask.
Yeah.
Obviously, in that time, that was masks and parties and masquerades and whatnot, and it almost has sort of a Da Vinci-ish quality. Is that a word? Da Vinci-ish? It is now. Da Vincian, perhaps I should say. Da Vincian quality to it. To like, you have to kind of look beyond the image to see what's really there.
Yeah.
So
it's not flattering, and it just basically shows him as a gentleman and not as a writer, and that again is something that is inconsistent with other images of writers during this period. And so we have to take all these factors into account. Something's going on here. And then there's a whole other issue of the Stratford Monument that is mentioned in the book. There is a monument to a Shakespeare in the local church there in Stratford-on-Avon. But, the monument, unfortunately, has been tampered with. If we have time, I can briefly tell you about it.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you, because why would they have done that? Was it just someone desecrating it to be stupid, or was it some sort of cover-up involved in that?
Yeah, well, there is this monument. It's on the wall, and it shows a man with a quill pen and paper. He's holding the quill pen, and he has an upturned mustache, and his pen and paper is like resting on a pillow. Okay? But the problem is if you look at a very contemporary drawing of the monument, it's very different. It shows a man with not an upturned mustache, but a downturned mustache and a beard, and a man who is resting his hands on a sack of some sort. There's no quill pen. There's no paper. It's a very different image, and the critics, the orthodoxy will say, "Oh, the person who made this drawing was incorrect." Well, it's not true. You can't. You have documentary evidence that it had been changed, and in fact, there was work done in that section of the church in 1649 and 1650, which was about 20 years after it was put up. So the point is, it's different than the original one, and again, this is something we have to take into account. It did not originally have a man holding a quill pen, and the name was not spelled as we know it today. It was spelled Shakespeare, Shakespeare, not Shakespeare as we know it. That's another interesting fact about the Stratford man. In most of the cases, when his name was spelled in documents, definitely in Stratford, right? The name was spelled like Shakespeare. It wasn't spelled like we know it. And certainly he knew how to spell his own name, right? So
yeah, you'd think.
It's another disconnect between the great author and the Stratford man.
Well, let me ask you this, because like I said, we've kind of jumped around on different stuff, but obviously this controversy has been going over, well over 150 years now, and why do you think it won't die or become resolved or whatever, or just sort of become it is what it is? What do you think's holding that up?
I think it's because, like we mentioned in the beginning, orthodoxy they're just sticking to their story. And the reason the controversy won't die, because this is over 150-year controversy, is because the Shakespeare orthodoxy have not proven that the Stratford man was the great author. They have no case. And that's why, in my opinion, it will never die. But but we have to be active, and and constantly question them. Like we need college students to question their professors when they're in a Shakespeare class. Say, well, hey, what is this authorship question? If you ask any Shakespeare professor, they'll say, oh, people who doubt it are members of the Flat Earth Society. Well, that's not right. There's hundreds of books and articles and many very prominent people, including Supreme Court justices, who say there's problems with the authorship. In fact, I encourage your listeners to go to doubtaboutwill.org. There's a whole list of people with academically high degrees who question the authorship.
Well, I know I was really surprised to learn some of the people. I mean, and I'm talking like people, it's not necessarily justices and whatever, but we'll know them right off the jump. Famous actors, famous writers, actors not just now, but as early back as Orson Welles. Can you tell me some of those individuals?
Yes, Orson Welles and Derek Jacobi. He's a very distinguished actor in England, and the late Sir John Gielgud. He's another distinguished actor. They all saw some problems here, and why should we not discuss these problems? Why shouldn't we bring them out and try to solve them? I mean, we're not trying to deny that the Stratford man was a real human being. He was, and he definitely had some sort of role. We don't know what it was, but he was definitely part of the theater. And let's learn what his role was. Let's learn who the real author was, and let's get everything in the right context. Because when this happens, we're going to appreciate the play so much more, especially Hamlet, which is almost a biography of the Earl of Oxford. There's so many incidents in there that reflect his life. Wouldn't that be more interesting? Wouldn't that encourage you to want to, make that jump to read the Elizabethan language and plow into Hamlet? I think it would inspire a lot of people,
Well, let me ask you this.
That's why I'm on this show.
Well, and we appreciate you being here. In the last couple minutes, let me ask you this. Let's say this is, negated or answered or whatever. Let's say there's some sort of conclusion to this, or there's not. Are you going to continue to kind of push this? Is there other agendas that you're looking into? Has this opened you up to any other strange occurrences that's happened that you're kind of on the trail of now? I'm kind of curious where you're going to go from this point.
Well, I was writing a list. I have about at least 10 more books that I want to do, but I work full time, in my day job.
Oh, I
so
understand.
it's a slow process. But yeah, this is kind of my life work in a way, my passion. And no, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep doing it and try and get the word out as much as I can. And because he really, if you read his sonnets, he really wanted us to know who he was. He was lamenting the fact that people would not know him. And, we should care about this man who has given so much to Western culture, and so many words and so many expressions. I mean, you read Hamlet, every other line is some famous expression that you can't, and that's where it originated, So who was this wonderful man? And we don't even have a real portrait of the great author, right? We just have that black and white image, and the one that's on the monument, which was replaced. And they're wrong anyway. It was the Earl of Oxford, and we do have real images. So lovers of Shakespeare will see the real man, what he looked like. In fact, he's on the cover of my book. It's a portrait that I own. And there are many others. So, and also what it would do, there are no, and a lot of people are surprised to learn this, there are no manuscripts in the great Shakespeare's handwriting. Nothing. You don't have no play, not one page of a play have survived. which was, again, very unusual. So if we know who the real author is, we might be able to go in the right direction and maybe find the original play manuscripts. And I believe they do survive somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure they're spirited away in someone's collection. Maybe might be the Vatican. Who knows what? It's something that's funny.
Yeah.
Your passion, and that's the only thing I can call it, because no one is going to go into this exhaustive research that you have done and not have a great passion. And it kind of makes me think of another writer, Dylan Thomas, and the whole "do not go gently into that good night." And you definitely have that kind of vibe about you. And, I wonder what the actual Shakespeare would think about this. I wonder if he would be kind of like, wow, they're still talking about this? Or that, what he would think now. Maybe or she, could it have been a noble woman? Everybody thinks it's a guy. Could it have been a woman? So there's still a lot of ground to cover and a lot of different points of view to look at, and it seems like
yes.
Well, it definitely seems like you've got a lot more ground to cover in regards of different directions you want to go in it and stuff. Let me ask you again, before we get too awful deep toward the end of the show, would you please give out your webpage again? I believe it was ShakespeareSuppressed.com.
Yes.
And I want to remind everybody, Shakespeare Suppressed, the uncensored truth about Shakespeare and his works, by Katherine Chiljan. Go get it, read it, love it. It's going to make you laugh, make you cry. It will become a part of you. And I will say this as a writer myself: if you enjoy it, and I don't see why you wouldn't, please leave good comments and get some stars up there. We appreciate it. That's sort of our life's blood. Your feedback to let us know what's going on. We can't live without that, because without the fans, we're just writing for ourselves. But is there anything you'd like to say about the next minute and a half before I do an outro?
Well, I would say that beyond my website, there's the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. That's an organization. You can Google it, and there's a lot of information on it. And I would really encourage our listeners to go to your public library and say, can you order this book? Because you don't have to buy it necessarily. You can have them buy it, because this type of work, it's a research work with over 600 footnotes. It should be in public libraries, and people should have access to this evidence. Yeah.
I'll go one better. I think it should be part of required reading in universities, if nothing more, to have an open discourse to really look into the whole kind of what do you want to put it? I don't say a circus necessarily, but that crazy whirling life that goes around them, because it gives again, the word passion comes to mind. It gives that opening to a character that sometimes people just kind of go, it's a guy and he's got the big collar and I can't do. I can't read this. But when you hear about how crazy, I don't say wackadoo, that's a word I use a lot, how wackadoo this whole thing was, and noblemen and this, and secrets and cover-ups, it's pretty cool, and like you said, we do want to see the original writer get his or her due.
Yes.
So
thank you.
Absolutely. So, Katherine, I appreciate you joining us. If you'll hang out for 1 second, I will do this outro, and I will be right back with you.
Thank you.
And there it is, everybody. Katherine Chiljan. Please check out her page. Please get her book. You're gonna thank me later. But for those that still have some sunlight, go out there and enjoy all that fun. But as the shadows grow long, as the sun sets, look out your back door, under your bed, in your closet. You never know. There may be a strange, illiterate William Shakespeare standing there with a bumpy head. But don't be afraid, because sometimes in fear there's learning. So go out there and have a good time. God bless you guys. Take care. And until next time, so long.